How y'all doing? A little while back, I've been on an Egyptian kick as far as reading goes. So I've read 3 books that's been on my shelves for quite a while here, and I finally got to reading them. I got started reading one. I figured while I'm on this, might as well read the other two. And we'll start with the first one that I've read. There it is, Egyptian Mythology, A Guide to the Gods and Goddesses and Traditions of Ancient Egypt by Geraldine Pinch. Found this in Barnes & Noble years ago. Now, it's not a very thick book. It's not the end-all, be-all of, of everything you want to know about Egyptian mythology, but it's a good reference book. It's a good starting point. So, let's see how the book's pretty straightforward. I mean, it basically is in 3 parts. The first part is the introduction, which talks about a very shortened overall cursory history of Egypt, where it started, the dynasties and all that, and through that it is good to know where how we find the stories of Egyptian mythology. Let's say, like, for instance, how do we know any of the stories through pyramid texts? That's stuff we find in pyramids or burial grounds. Coffin texts, again, that talks about stories involving that. Literature, however complete they are, most of it is very incomplete. Underworld book and books of the dead. Through understanding the history, we understand and understanding where we find these stories. And it's good to know this because, you're dealing with about, give or take, 5,000 years of history of this culture here. And a lot of what we know Egyptian is generally in the broad strokes, but when it gets to the specifics, there's been changes here and there. So I'm going to say up front, if you're the type of person that has a seriously a very hard time understanding the Trinity in Judeo-Christian religion, you're having a heck of a time with all the things about this. Just to let you know. And this is, and that's, because you have a god, they say, for instance, a god who came about and his eye leaves him. That is a separate god or goddess, but at the same time, it's the same aspect of him. Stuff like that happens all the time. But I'm digressing about this point. So, the second part of this book is the mythological timeline. Again, it's a good, overall story about the creation of Egyptian mythology, its creation myths, and all of the creation of the gods and all the events that happens with them, to the current pharaohs and all that. This, in the middle of this, you'll find the great battle between Osiris killed by his brother Seth, and then Horus gain, his own, gets back at Seth and becomes king becomes the main ruler while his father rules the underworld with Anubis and all that stuff. Again, this is, it's not, again, you can't make this the end all be all, but it's a good broad stroke mythological timeline, because I'm sure the more text we find about this, you'll find slight variations of this, there's a bit change in the details. Now, the next one, the third part of this is deities, themes, and concepts. It's basically the glossary of Egyptian myth. Let's say you want to talk about the moon. You look at moon and read about what it means about that, what animals symbolize and everything. Of course, it talks about the gods and goddesses and what their roles are and everything, and some of the stories about that. And again, I think it's a good reference book. Some of the stuff you probably, would find interesting, like baboons. They serve Thoth, the god of knowledge and everything. Hippos, interesting aspect of that. So when you read about hippos, are they a good aspect or a bad aspect? Well, it depends if they're male and female, and it's little details like that. Now, going off somewhat of a tangent, one of my favorite role-playing game books I liked reading as a teen is Werewolf the Apocalypse. And Werewolf the Apocalypse is a tribe called the Silent Striders. My favorite tribe. I don't usually have favorites, but I always tend to go with those guys because I love the Egyptian theme about it. And they wrote this with the Egyptian mythology interwoven with their tribal culture. And one of the characters in that is named, sorry if I messed this up, Wepwawet. Now, he's a Silent Strider that's kind of stuck in the spirit realm, but he's also an Egyptian god. He's named after that. Who is Wepwawet? Well, imagine Anubis, who is a black jackal-headed god. But this one is, take that image, but make him a white-headed jackal god. And I won't get too much into this, but the thing is, I kind of find it interesting and find those little parallels. And of course, at the end of this, it gives you a further reading, another glossary for quick definitions, and so forth like that. Again, this is a great reference book of Egyptian mythology and a good starting off point. Okay, so if there's a flaw in this book, while it is illustrated, it's probably not illustrated enough for you to, look at all the things that it describes. It gives descriptions of it, and you find some pictures that work. They'll show you some artwork like this, papyrus and all that. But if you are trying to find, okay, so what does Satet and Anuket, you want to know what those goddesses look like, you probably have to get a computer ready and look that up for yourself. So if there's a flaw on that, it's usually because it's not illustrated enough to illustrate everything. Granted, it's kind of hard for a book like this to do that with everything if there is an illustration on that. Not only take more research there, it's probably going to make it more costly as well, especially if even with black and white. Putting it in colors, much more. So have a computer ready, do Google image, whatever it is. And as a little food for thought about this is when I was reading this, I was thinking about how Egyptian culture is known among in popular culture. Think about it as a person who just takes Egypt lore through osmosis. What did you find in popular culture that you would know of that involves Egypt of any kind? Well, within probably since the 90s, we had the movie Stargate and a spin-off series of Stargate SG-1, and then, of course, that leads to Stargate Atlantis. And to be honest, I never cared much for the Stargate SG-1. I lost interest within the first season. Much as I liked the movie growing up, I have to admit, after all these years, it didn't really age well. Pretty simplistic for something as ambitious of a concept. And of course, that idea of Stargate from the beginning takes place from Chariots of the Gods, where ancient cultures are influenced by ancient aliens, and Egyptian has always been one of the center points of that type of thinking. Good for fiction, but the more they try and delve into that, the more they get away with lore. Oh, so they use the names, but it doesn't really talk about, it doesn't integrate the lore that is known of what we found in the text to, and integrates in the series. Granted, it is hard to do. Egyptian mythology, especially when you read this book, you got the broad strokes of, who the gods are and what they serve. And there's the overall story about the cosmology from creation to the pharaohs being the descendants of Horus and all that in between. But with that, it is, once you get to specifics, you think about this, when you spend over around give or take 5,000 years, even if you pass down the stories and write them down, some people would change a god or goddess and roles here and there. Even with Isis trying to bring back Osiris back to life, they would have a goddess or to help them out, and another text would say, well, it was this goddess, but then another text would change one of the goddesses out. You find this all the time. We do that today with current entertainment and all that. We always change a little bit here and there to make our stories stand out, even though it's not the original. Granted, I understand why, because if you tell the same story too many times, we know what's going to be interesting, and we've heard this story before. And I think, I don't think they necessarily did this for entertainment purposes. Of course, I'm sure people like to do this. This is mythology. This is their religion. This is their thought processes of their daily lives. It's all integrated together. So whether you're spiritual or not, you can't talk about the ancient past from an atheist perspective. Now, granted, not everybody believed in the punishment of the gods. Look how many tombs have been grave robbed over the years, despite the supposed protections over the years. There's hardly any tombs out there in current Egypt that has been robbed by grave robbers. But that's another story for one of the other books I read about recently. So, So one of the things, I'm almost digressing here, but I think it's a good point that another example of popular culture that we may know of involving ancient Egypt is Gods of Egypt. That movie that bombed so hard, I think nuclear physicists could take notes about that. And that was a movie that tried too hard to bring out what was cool about Egypt. everything was big, extravagant. I'm not a big or a person that argues that practical versus CGI, but it's one of those that I think CGI has been. It's not the fact that it's used too much. I think it's used incorrectly. That's, I think, is an argument for that. But I'm digressing. That's a movie that bombed. You saw all the elements there. Okay, you have Horus. He lost his eye to Seth. And Seth is used as the main villain, and everything. And they tried to make it like a good versus evil. Here are your good gods. Here's your evil god, and so forth. It really is not that simple. Any god or goddess could be malevolent or benevolent, but Seth is interesting in the fact that he is not a Lucifer type character. He's more chaotic. He'd be good or bad depending on the story he's in. Yes, he killed Horus and took his, and was later. No, he didn't kill. He killed Osiris and took Horus's eye, and later Horus got his revenge and through a tribunal of the other gods. Favored Horus is now the ruler of the gods. Seth is not, but Seth afterwards is serving on Ra's bark across the sky, fighting off Apophis, who's more of the continuous evil spirit. So think more Seth as Loki than Lucifer as far as his character goes. Seth is interesting because there's a lot of in popular culture, like Werewolf the Apocalypse, as I mentioned earlier. There's the followers of Set, which are a vampire clan that have a serpent bent to their appearances and all that in their worship. Even though Seth himself was never described as a serpent, he's sort of they have what they call the Set animal, and it's interesting because he's kind of looks like Anubis, and he has sort of a jackal-like form, but his head has these sort of weird shaped ears. And let me see if I can find that illustration. But if I like this. This may not see it right here. See, it has these weird shaped ears. The nose is not exactly dog-like, kind of bends down a little bit. That's Seth. Seth or Set. There's various descriptions of his name, but they call it a Set animal because they don't know what exactly it is. Maybe amalgamation, maybe of a dog-like face, maybe those little ears, maybe ossicones like a giraffe or what have you. But no one really knows. They just call it a Set animal because you see an illustration at all. So I think what it is that we, if we rely on popular culture as our starting point for something like Egyptian mythology, we're going to make a derivative, and it's going to lose what makes us interested in the first place. And I think a book like this for your starting point is a good, thing to have on your shelf, because you want to go back to the node of the history and the mythology of Egypt, and therefore start from there to write any sort of creative works or fiction and all that. So that's an advantage of this book. So, but again, it's while illustrated, it's not fully illustrated. It doesn't have everything you want to know. So get your computer ready. Says okay, so that's how it's illustrated here. Or you might find certain cities, just certain looks and all that. But again, good to have a second, good starting point for anything Egyptian mythology. But if you can find another one afterwards that's more up to date with more information, go ahead and go for that. So. Again, Egyptian Mythology, A Guide to Gods and Goddesses and Traditions of Ancient Egypt by Geraldine Pinch. If you find something like this or something similar, give it a go. Thank you all for watching. You have a nice day.